Good afternoon, or greetings, Sister ChenziRa. It's lovely to meet you and to have an interview with you, knowing your accolades and knowledge from speaking to you last time. So I'm quite happy and privileged to speak to you. You have done a lot. You are the Cultural Heritage Ambassador, educator, creative activist, priestess, holistic natural therapist, organizer, publisher, author, mother, and grandmother. Good afternoon. Nice
Greetings, Hotel.
Great Hotep, yes.
It's an honor and a privilege to be here for a number of reasons. So I would be most humbled to open in the form that I'm accustomed. And I'll start with Amasu and Pantel, Sauksu Emihran Pantel, Ahura, Makiti Pahura. And I'm simply saying, for those that aren't as accustomed to hearing the meta nature in its utterance form, we give thanks and praise to the One Most High. We live each day daily for the One Most Divine, and we shall do it tomorrow, just as we do it today, giving thanks and asking for Ma'at, Jehuti, Ost, Asar, Pita, Sekhmet, to keep the balance. So it's an honor and a privilege to be with you, Sen Yashma. It's been a while.
It's been a while. The last time we spoke was a few years ago. It was, I think, in 2020, when I had to have the second International Black Carpet Awards. I was introduced to you, and it was quite an honor to meet you and speak to you because you had so much to share, and I think you're still doing what you do because it's your call. Or your
Giving
call.
thanks.
Your call,
Giving
yeah.
thanks. Giving thanks. It's always a privilege in many respects. There's many things that are linked to African spirituality. And as we were sharing off air, it always requires that we look at things through a lens of air, fire, earth, water, and spirit. Those elements that are guiding the Kerisheta are guiding all of the directions, all of the forces, all of the energies that we speak of. And we're using the term African more so AF, RAKAN. So we're speaking of the soul, the original, the indigenous first flesh of Ra, right? That we're speaking of original people and original systems, right? So it will not only be what persons may anticipate is or know as Egyptian or even Kemetic, but it's actually a link to ancestral, ancient, African, Nubianu, Kushianu, Kemetu heritage legacy. So when we're speaking of the Ankh legacy, we're speaking of the entire expanse of not only the Hapi River, but all of the lands and masses and influences that our ancestors contributed to. So I'm looking forward to our discussion, more of a conversation today. I'm looking forward.
Yes. So, dear sister, at this time when everybody or most people have turned their back away from our great ancestors of Kemetu, Kush, what drove you to where people are running away from? Because it has been demonized by colonizers and how it has been evil. What drove you? What made you do the Sankufa to the ancestors and where it all started?
That's a question that has a lot of elements to my ability to answer. Ultimately, it's a destiny piece. It wasn't as if I went out and did like a heavy search. The search, I should say, is more like a research piece as I've grown. And I come up from a very powerfully royal, yet humble family that always instilled the importance of recognizing and honoring the Almighty as the creator with a variety of names. So, of course, we learned God. Of course, we learned Yahweh. We learned Jehovah. We learned of the Elohim. We learned those things through a Christian, Judaic Christian realm, but then it expanded because our families span through not only portions of the Caribbean where I reside, no, and live, no, and have been socialized a majority, more than almost all of my life. It is the space that is directly tied in this southern hemisphere of the earth to our ancestral African traditions. So whether it was through the foods, through various elements of culture, various values, and more morals, and the manner in which people live, the way that we gave birth to children, the way we raised children, the way that we embrace nature. And I want to pause on the nature part because that's the part that made me recognize, some people said, oh, you were born with the veil, and that's why. That may have had something to contribute. You were the only female child to come from the womb of your mother.
Mm.
That could have been another part.
You're lucky.
I mean, and I keep saying, there's a lot of different spiritually grounded aspects of how spirituality is the essence of my being. It wasn't that I went out and just wanted to become a priestess. Because believe me, I at one point, the way that the earth community moves, you don't want to have anything to do with anything that looks like religion because it always seemed very divisive. It was warfare and hostility. It was always these stories of killing the firstborn or killing all the females or killing all the men. There was always some death kill vibe when you look at religiosity. And in African spiritual systems, and I keep speaking of it, and maybe the better term I should use is its ecosystem. It's a system that has its own ecology. It's a system, these are systems, and I say them plural because while I am a keeper of the Kra shrine temple of Osset and Sekhmet, I sit in a space where I've been influenced by many of the traditional Western religions. Like most of us can recite and just by rote memory know biblical texts, whether we know it in Hebrew, Greek, Latin, English, whatever language, but we're also spiritual beings. And so the essence of African traditional institutions and ecosystems are have always been drawn to me because I've seen them wherever I go, when I'm in the garden, if I am given a responsibility to attend to animals in terms of husbandry, if I am to be given a task to collect herbs, that was one of the things that kept me looking at African traditional spiritual systems. Because as a naturopath, you're gonna learn how to be involved in spirituality because the plants commune with you and you
Mm.
commune with them. And there's an air, not to say that Eurasian spiritual systems do not have that, but the Eurasian spiritual systems are the grandchildren, the great grandchildren of our African traditional institutions and spiritual ecosystems. So essentially, and I hope that I've answered without it going too out there. I'm not trying to make this a completely metaphysical conversation. I'm really looking for us to be able to just have a very basic, a very meaningful recognition, at least for myself, what kept me in that space. And I would ask, is this the right path? And I would get the signs. And I made sure that I wasn't hallucinating. I made sure I was not under the influence of anything that made me think that it was something else, of any sort. I would not use external items outside of things that I'm guided to use when I'm in an initiatory or a spiritual ceremonial space, right? And that has been what has guided my life for a long time. I'm moving, I'm defined chronologically as an eldris, and I'm well over 60. And persons go like,
Well,
hmm. And I have to express to persons that most of my life, it's always been like that. I've been guided. And I've asked, not only guided, not ridden, make sure I say that. I don't let things ride me, but I stay in that ancestral balancing space. So when I speak of Ma'at, I'm speaking of Ma'at, not just the noun Ma'at as a feminine principle, but the verb actionable part of Ma'at, of truth, justice, order, reciprocity, balance, divine righteousness, and harmony, to the best of my ability. I still sit in a human frame.
Ashe. Who has been or who was, I know you brought up in that environment where there was different religious systems around you, but who influenced you, apart from you being guided, into Kemetic or African spirituality? And why not the Western one?
I have to give honor, recognition, and due form to one of my Babas, an ancestor, Dr. Yosef Ben Yakanan, who not only was a teacher for me, not only a Jegna, a warrior, some people like to use the term mentor, but that's a little different, but he took time to leave institutional knowledge and wisdom that we were encouraged to study. He had persons doing tours into ancestral temples and spaces and all types of edifices and learning to engage with language, even if the language was seen to some to be no longer useful. Dr. Yosef Ben Yakanan helped me to really stay grounded in, and we didn't always agree, especially when it came to dietary things. He had this, he was a Caribbean, African, Ethiopian brother. So he want to eat what he want to eat. But
Yeah.
in the times that he would come to one of his homes, which is the Isle of St. Croix, where he spent his childhood, he spent a significant amount of time offering his research, his studies. So he gave us guidance and understanding the three primary Western religions and the impact that it had on African people. His work, Black Man, the Nile, and its family, is a stellar work, not just because Dr. Ben was awesome, but because it gave the details to what transpired to understanding the importance of the science and the arts imbued inside of African traditional spiritual systems. And so that's one. And there, the list is pretty extensive in terms of becoming an initiate and an aunt carrier. That was through the work. And again, another ancestor quite recent, Baba Haru Ankara Samad Sepata of Smaitawi Ascension Renaissance and keeper, chief high priest of the Shrine of Ptah. It was through his work, his lifelong livication, and not just as a saw maker, a jewelry designer par excellence, through the studio of Ptah, which still, he left that institution, so that's still ongoing through his sons primarily, and those that he was able to share his craftsmanship as a keeper of Ptah. It was the teachings of the legacy that provided the Peranku, the House of Life, which is one of the eldest higher education systems in record for humanity. And I'm sure by now, especially with AI in place, that there will be others that preceded that, because we're talking going back millions of years, yeah? But this system that Baba Haru Ankara Samad Sepata and many others, that we would be here for a while if I were to navigate through that lens of those that guided me in this particular legacy. There were several sistren that were very instrumental in my efforts. And as much as I would like to spend time just going through various names, it becomes a very extended list because many of the sistren, like Maria Tumutemut, keeper of many of these powerful shrines, as an educator, as an initiate of the tradition, she too guided and offered wisdom teachings that were practical. So that again, hewn, or I should say, had me on the potter's wheel of Punum and allow me to form and get guided with more clarity, precision, and so forth. And then studying the work of many eldresses that are again now ancestors, because I used to be able to speak of them in the living,
Mm-hmm.
and I still speak of them in eternal life frames. But to know that we can, at this point, they are no longer amongst us that are walking on the earth. It's a powerful legacy. All of the women coming out of the Universal Negro Improvement Association African Communities League have impacted my work in African traditional spirituality. I speak of eldresses, and I always refer to her as Queen Mother first, but Dr. Tendai, she has been again, in the system of Ifa, and very grounded in understanding Yoruba traditions and very respectful of African traditional spiritual systems. And it's eldresses like her still amongst the living that give me that grounding. And even before they thought that I was really watching and observing how they were moving, because I usually observe persons first and then I work with people. I realize you cannot just know people by just reading their books. And like nowadays, you can't just look at what people say on the social media. It's important that you have like an organic, when you do work with people, then you understand if they really doing this through a lens of the periphery, or if they're actually doing this work because this is their life journey and this is the fullness and the strength that they bring in to the spiritual system. And then I continue. I've been very blessed, Sister Queen Anaquette. I knew her as Endless First, another initiatist who, again, brought in not only the three Western primary religions, but shared teachings around Buddhism, Hinduism, and then linked that ancestral root right into African traditional spirituality. Those are just some, and I have sistren amongst me now, Queen Mother Dr. Omo, you know, um, coming out through Barbados. I came to know of her work as an educator when she was a head administrator, principal in Tortola, in the British Virgin Islands. And she's a yogi. However, her knowledge system of African traditional spirituality traversing through Nigeria and other parts of the African world influenced how I began to look at my own studies to make sure that I was grounded in Ma'at, in Jehuti, in Seshite, especially being a keeper of the Aset, Sekhmet, temple, and shrine. And then I have other initiatives that I continue to work with, and initiates as well. I just have learned that it's important that we see this as a shared, it's a legacy piece. It's not I am the priestess, or you are the priestess, or you are the priest, etc. It becomes a layer of respectability to the work and the care for our shared humanity, and then showing that legacy and the work that comes within that legacy. As I've mentioned earlier, when we speak of the Ankh legacy, we're always speaking of eternal life. And we're speaking of eternal life in its cycles, and as it evolves, and as it transmutates, and as it transforms not only individuals, but families, and communities and societies and civilizations. How does that, so that's a lot of what comes up in that particular work. There's a
Um,
lot of names I could list,
okay.
but next time I will encourage persons email me to askspeaks at
Okay.
gmail.com, and then when you see the annotated bibliographies that I offer around African traditional spirituality, you'll see most of the persons that are in those documents or in that annotated bibliography are persons that I've either trained with or worked alongside, learned from, and were guided by, and a majority now are ancestors. So it's been a while.
Now, when you at comparative, um, is there how would you compare the different African traditions, like you like Orisha, Voodoo? Is there any comparisons or commonalities with all those different spiritual systems that we can still um, assign it to Kemet?
The term compare becomes very challenging and different for
Okay.
me,
Hmm.
only because I know I'm gonna present it in a form that is in the heights of respect.
Yes.
Many times when we're talking about African traditional spirituality,
Hmm.
it is seen, or even when we say words like voodoo,
Hmm.
or we say words like traditional Africa, you say
Yeah.
Africa, by the time you get past that first syllable of AF,
Uh-huh.
persons are already twisting up their face because it's like it's not really spiritual,
Hmm.
or it's not really a religion, or it doesn't compare that term to the primary three Western religions that most persons are accustomed. Nobody seems to have a big question when it comes to Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. They're kind of like a given.
I'm coming to that one.
Yeah, and I just want to highlight that there are comparisons because, for example, numbers like seven, numbers like nine, the connection to astronomy, the connection to astrology, the recognition of the arts, architecture, agriculture, and the various sciences and arts that govern the universe are very similar. The way that we deal with birth, the way that we engage with marriage, which is an institution that some persons stay away from in contemporary times, forgetting that we can look into current temples in Egypt, United Arab Republic, to this day, and see texts of the contractual arrangements of marital unions
Mm.
created through the Temple of Ast, in the Temple of Ast, and others, right? So they were contractual agreements to protect women and children, as well as to have men honor that protection of women and children. So when you have the religious infusion of talking of marriage or talking about the yoke that happens between man and woman, right? These are things that we'll find in almost every religion, and we'll find it that many times these religions, even when we talk about the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost, we know in our system that that's coming from the legacy teaching of Ast, Asar, and Heru.
Hmm.
And it's the same Trinity, right?
Hmm.
We know that there are similarities within Ifa traditions in terms of the nine entities. When we speak of Orisha, we're speaking of those divine principles that manifest, yes, as male, female, right? And we always remember sometimes when they speak of the trickster, people talk about even Ishu. There's so many commonalities that sometimes people actually will go and make Tefnut similar to this, Shu similar to that, Geb similar to this, and go from all of the Pautnetu, from As, the Sar, Haru, going into Ptah, the Noon, Hra. We can do this. This is a conversation that would be a wonderful conversation and discourse when we're willing to speak from a place of Ma'at, where we're comfortable enough to know that the The strategy and tactic may be somewhat different, but how we get to the end of the pot might be different. But we're going to get to the end of the pot in the same pot because the intention is to show the elevation and the transmutation and respect and honor, the regality, the royalty, the tranquility, the peace of being at one with the divine, creative, infinite source. So whether you say Jehovah, or you say Oludumare, or you say Netera, or you say Krishna, however that navigates, and we keep seeing it. We keep seeing. That's why a lot of our brothers and sisters are very comfortable in Buddhism and Hinduism and Christianity and Islam and Judaism because it's familiar. Because out of the one came the many. And I'm doing my best to keep it in a more simplistic frame because sometimes when we start to speak in using the vernacular and the historiography of our ancestral ancient African Nubianu Kushianu Kemetu heritage legacy, it can become challenging for some because they don't know that. They don't know that narrative. And so there's been a number of opportunities and publications and research that's been done, so that's where you would speak, Dr. Raketi Amen. She's like the stellar linguist when it comes to understanding the Meta Nature. Some of her students and masters in their right as well, like one of my brothers, I've always, knew him since I was in school years, and that is Dr. Mfundisi Jehutimes Hassan K. Salim, the author of Spiritual Warriors or Healers. And I encourage persons, as I'm saying some of these publications, mentioning some of these persons' names, go and search for yourself. Don't just look at the persons that came into the legacy 5, 6, 7, 10 years ago. Look for the ones that had like longevity, that have done this work, not for external show, but actually this is the way that they live. So that's the other part about African traditional spirituality. You should, you don't have to do anything, but you should respect the legacy enough to make that the way that you live and the essence of how you engage. And not everyone is in that particular platform. And sometimes it's challenging because we're living in a world that does not authentically, they're barely respecting our humanity. And that's just this frame, much less the higher consciousness of our humanity, which is beyond that which is tangible. They don't have, and so if they can't put their talons, their fangs in it and call it XYZ to meet their meaningful needs, then there's always that question. You spend 25 years defending that we're Kemetu, or defending that we are the authentic original indigenous ancestors in the present time, or that we have to defend what belongs to us across the Hapi Nile Valley civilization. But that's what I'm saying. The whole idea when we start to, that's why I'm very mindful when we talk about comparison. What I like to look at it as is I have sisters and brothers that are in a variety of different systems. And I can go into their places of worship and fellowship, and I do so respectfully. Most of them that are close to me are able to reciprocate. And then there are those that cannot and are incapable, probably in this entire lifetime and maybe lifetimes to come, because they're not understanding that this is not about who was first. This is about
the continuation.
Respect. Exactly.
Yeah, the reason why I ask you,
see, I love that. I love that. Give thanks.
The reason why I ask you about, I look at a word like comparative or comparison is to see, to show the interchangeability, because it may not be the same name, the same image, it may have a different twist to it. One may think it's different and start saying our thing and your thing. But would it be beautiful if you could go into any of our spiritual systems and still feel connected to the whole. And it will not take away anything from who you are being a priestess from the house of Ptah. That's why I'm asking the question.
It's an excellent question. I want to give another exceptional shout out to a number of sisters and brothers. Very recently, actually, we were in Nigeria. And one of the things that, be more specific, we flew into Abuja for an international conference on African indigenous systems.
Mm,
And we
nice.
were at the Federal University of Lokoja. And beyond the journey, you know, because it was, you had to fly here and fly there. Most of us met in Kemet. You know, we met in Cairo, and I thought it was fabulous. It was a direct flight. And we had to go from the east coast of the US, fly all the way to Cairo to then go back to Nigeria in order to not spend 2 days in travel, only a day. But what was powerful in this particular gathering, and I keep asking my sister and brethren to recognize that it was an opportunity for brothers and sisters within the African continent and coming from the global African spaces, diaspora to some, to actually have an opportunity to, as academics and as homegrown scholars, to share their systems and to share the commonality as well as what may appear to be different. I think that that was the part that made me really come to see that there are so, and they publish their work. I think that that's where that's the next place that we're going in terms of having the ability to share our knowledge systems, our wisdom teachings, our cultural heritage narratives, our traditional institutions, and only share initiatory work when it's permissible. Because we've already seen what has happened with persons not being prepared and properly initiated, trained, ceremoniously prepared for advanced, higher spiritual science and arts. And they think they can play with it, and it's not to be played with, right? So I'm really, I'm really grateful that I had that opportunity to just get a feel for this whole concept of, quote, indigenous African spiritual systems. I think that a number of people did not know the fullness of the Ankh legacy. And what was beautiful, that at least the way that it was presented to us, what was beautiful was that it gave us an opportunity in this. And I want to take a minute and just share a summary of what we presented on, just to give context. This was the third international conference of the Academy of Africana Indigenous Religions, Theology, and the Arts. And I want persons to remember this. This is at a federal university in Nigeria. I'm going to pause. The Academy of Africana Indigenous Religions, Theology, and Arts.
In Africa, in Nigeria.
In Nigeria.
Okay.
And it's actual, you know, it's part of the university. They have an actual facility. They've established, you know, a body of faculty. They're working on doing these conferences annually. They actually, what was powerful with brothers and sisters came, and they came well researched. You know, sometimes, you know, in the West, persons are real quick to come to a conference, maybe have like an abstract and speak freely. No, these brothers and sisters came with the full paper and were distributing the paper to you while they were presenting, right? I want to highlight the level of efficiency, efficacy, and not just contemporary academic engagement, but they came with a very ancestrally driven form and framework of edification. It wasn't just education. The intention was to share, to impart knowledge, to have discourse. I mean, I watch sister and brethren really question and kind of, I mean, if I were practicing Christian and some of the persons in there, you know, they were pastors, reverends, etc., bishops, etc., they took some heat. They had to take some heat. How can you believe this faith that helped to enslave you? It was some very deep discourse that happened, and it was done very amicably. It was done, and maybe that's why they had food and snacks all around, so people were like at calm, you know. So you know, hungry people get a little bit antsy, right? But it was powerful to see that, like for us, you know, our presentation, you know, led by Dr. Anika Daniels, and again, she's not only an academic, but she's also an administrator in her academic work. But her theological, if you want to call it that, position that she holds is Hemet Neter. So she's a Kemetic ancient Egyptian priestess as well. And she is also an initiate of the Shrine of Ptah. So it was wonderful through her moderation, through her invitation, her way of opening this up was by bringing other priestesses with her so that we were able to speak on the sacred origins and living balance and how African spirituality depicts creation narratives, the feminine principle in nature through language, and again with a public health lens, because that's her area of expertise, right? And it was powerful because what we were able to do was, in the midst of all of these other, you know, the Ifa traditions, Yoruba coming forward, Hausa traditions, Christianity, Islam, Judaism, some terms I don't know how to pronounce properly, through all of that. No, I'm just being, it was beautiful to be, and I want to let your listeners know that this was an experience that we had, yes, but it was designed so that we would be able to share that this is something that is ongoing on a regular. This is something that is part of the legacy teaching so that we can be able to sit and have these types of conversations. I've always wondered how persons can be, they can do yoga, do the spiritual part on yoga, love the Hindu tradition all the way. And then when you tell them anything about the African yogic experience, and like that yoga is coming out of yoga and the spirit that's in the center in this body frame. And you start showing them, like in the temple of Beni Hassan, maybe about 3-4 hours, about 2 hours south of Cairo, the Beni Hassan temple, one of the ones that people tend not to go to. Because when you look inside, you're seeing meters and meters of temple drawings of martial arts, of African pre-karate, aikijitsu, jiu-jitsu, aido, taekwondo, qigong. I'm just saying. And you're seeing the postures, the sticks, the swords. You're seeing the dance movements, with knowing that dance is the root of yoga. You're seeing yoga in temples that have existed for tens of thousands of years. And so persons tend to, so that's why what's happening now in contemporary Kemet, that's known as Egypt, with the new Grand Museum, there was a lot of reinterpretation. So it's important for persons to look at the work of persons like our Baba, Dr. Yosef Ben Yakanan, because he was taking these pictures and documenting these things before they got a chance to change the narrative, before they got a chance to change the complexion and the nose and the cheekbones of the people, get ready to go into my vernacular, in ancient Kemet, and show that there was a connection between ancient Kemet, Nubia, and Kush. You know, people like to just focus on the war part, but that wasn't the sole part. There was a harmony, there was a unification, or else all of those things that people still digging up and trying to find up to now wouldn't have been available at all, right? So I think it's important that we look at the similarities first before we get into the dissimilarities and highlight that. Even though we're very good at doing dissimilarities, we're very good at that. I came first and you second, and you are under me or I'm over. That's a human ego trait that we're working through, right? But there are a couple of things that are, uh, when we talk about African ancestral systems, I always turn to what allowed us to be able to be in Ma'at. What are the elements and the principles of that? How are we able to, when we speak of Ta'ert, that, we think of sacred foods, what does that do for us? And how is that related to other systems? Almost every system deals with agriculture, architecture, astronomy, and the arts and sciences. They govern the entire universe. All of them. All. And then, we can add, when people want to add more 21st century, well, you've got to add technology. But the technology has always been grounded in agriculture, architecture, astronomy, and arts and sciences. Right. So I would, rest there for now in terms of some of the spiritual systems, similarities, and how we are able to present them in a way that goes beyond just the Abrahamic traditions that people are very comfortable with, and looking at pre-Abrahamic traditions, and that it helps to explain why there's these contemporary traditions and religious systems are so familiar to our people, because it's coming out of their great 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 grandparents, relatives, ancestral traditional systems.
Now, you mentioned a while ago that you went to Abuja to the conference of in Nigeria, and you and it took like sisters or queens, like
Yes.
like Dr. Anika,
Yes.
and you all went. I mean, if you look at the Abrahamic faith, you seldom hear about priestesses or prophetesses in the Bible. Women are seldom mentioned. In certain churches, you find, according to the Bible, it said, if a woman have to ask a question, she would have to tell it to her husband, and her husband would tell it, would ask the priest on her behalf. In the African religion, um, um, because the sisters went, um, where you think that came from, where in the Abrahamic faith, sisters are not to ask questions, and in African spirituality, sisters can be priestesses, represent and go out there and put the work in. Where you think that come from, and how you think it has affected sisters in evolving in the spiritual fraternities as you have become a spiritual sister in the systems?
Yeah, that's a loaded question, and I know that we do not have another 6 hours, because that one I would like to pull out data and like print out some of my books and my articles, because ultimately, in essence, the balance of male and female is at the core of any most traditional African spiritual systems. There's the balance of male, female, of yin yang to some people, to really recognizing that the divine father is alongside the divine mother for there to be divine children.
Yes.
And that that's why we spoke of AST, the divine mother principle.
That's
Asa,
it.
yeah, well, Ast first. What people say Aset, some people know her as Isis in the Greco-Roman vernacular as the divine mother. and Asar or Osiris in the Greco-Roman vernacular as the divine father, and Heru, who is that divine child, right? And we always speak of Heru, and you'll hear people speak of Heteru, right? So there's a connection in terms of understanding the Trinity in many respects, but recognizing that for it to be grounded, squared, it would be four, right? So it would be male, female, or female, male, right? And
Yes.
then it's really important that in contemporary Western religion, because of the type of power that was seen and witnessed and observed of the matriarchy, not just a matriarchal or matrilineal system of things coming through the line of the mother, but a matriarchal, a balanced. So if a woman led, it was because she had the skills, talents, and expertise to do so. It wasn't just because she was female, right? And if a man led, it wasn't just because he was male, it was because he had the skills, talents, and expertise to do so, right? And usually, with few exceptions and without any misinterpretation of what is in archival record and what archaeologists, anthropologists, and their predecessors found in these ancestral spaces, in Kemet, in other parts of Africa, in Indus Kush, India, in Khmer, Cambodia, China, we can go to the earth. You'll see that there was always an elevation and a respect that the throne always was represented as a woman. So even a man couldn't sit on the throne without there being that feminine seat for him to sit on, right? So sometimes people overlook that part. I mean, in more contemporary times, His Imperial Majesty Haile Selassie I, coronated with who? On the throne of where? Through what lineage with what? Right? So we speak of His Imperial Majesty Emperor Haile Selassie I, you have to speak of Her Imperial Majesty Empress Menen.
And then, yeah.
Right? So when people are speaking of these, and again, and that's in Rastafari, it's very Judeo-Christian, yes. Its authentic ancestral root, however, is very Nubian, very Kushianu, very Ethiopian, very old school Ethiopia. When Ethiopia wasn't just the little inland spot it is now, it took up that entire northeastern corner of the continent as we know it, right? It took up a lot more space than where we see Eritrea and then the split of Djibouti, the split of Tigray in those spaces, and Eritrea, etc.
Mm-hmm.
So it's important. You got to look at like older maps. We need to look at older teachings, and that's something that Dr. Yosef Ben Yakanan and those that followed him and those that preceded him provided that type of literature, that type of narrative. And then you can go to the temples with some exceptions, because if you are sanding off teachings in the name of saying that you're doing a new museum or a new collection, and you're moving things from their original space to put it on exhibition for people to elevate a newcomer to Kemet as the original. And I say it up front, and that's one of the reasons I used to have my own issues in doing this legacy work, because there were times there was a time you could go to the temples and we would do our tours. And we would use the information that we gathered from our African ancestral contemporary scholars. The work of Dr. Sheikh Anta Diop. I wish that I had been of adult age during his lifetime. I could have really,
one of the pioneers.
The legacy of work that he left for us is incomparable to almost all of the data, resources, research that we're gathering. Now they've actually used his platform and research to try to AIify it. And it's amazing because, again, he left such a vast amount of information and scientific data that was properly analyzed and accurate, that, they're going to be able to do volumes and volumes and volumes and volumes and volumes of encyclopedia work for decades. right? And I'm saying, I speak of him, in our contemporary spaces, we have elders like, and I always refer to him as not just doctor, but, Baba, come in, we've got some folks that are doing some great work. I mean, you've got a number of scholars that are showing us the homegrown grounding of the legacy in contemporary times, persons, Dr. Robin Walker. I mean, there's so many that we could list in this list of lists that are providing this type of informative research. Even persons like Professor Tony Browder started uncovering things to the point that they actually attempt to keep us from going to our temples that are the temples that we are the authentic ascendants of. So it's kind of like someone telling you you can't go to your grandmother's house anymore.
How do you say, sorry, ascendant, not descendant?
Right, ascendants.
Ascendants.
Because
Good.
we're ascending. Yeah, we're
Ascending.
ascending.
Yes.
Yeah, we're ascending. And for those persons that are comfortable with the word descendant, because that's how the English vernacular lets us speak of that you descend from. But no, we ascend from them.
100%. I agree with that ascending.
Right. Because it lets us, but to go into what you had shared, because I know our time is limited and short, but I want to highlight a couple of things. That feminine principle was always central because it was not just a masculine principle and a feminine principle. It was seeing ma'at. So it was reciprocity, it was balance, it was harmony. And that is seen as divine righteousness. Again, not nouns, but things you do, things you implement, right? So yes, the women in our birthing years, we spend a significant amount of time being hidden, raising children and giving that 190,000% to raising those children in a safe, protected nest. So when they come forward, then you'll see the women come out and be more engaged and more social, etc. This thing of women having children and then going to work in 6 days, that's not an African tradition that we kept. That's not. And I'm not saying, for those sisters that can do it, power to you, right? But, we had like 45 days of waiting, 90 days inside, time to let your womb catch itself, make all your body organs come back in order. We actually thought about these things because we know we do a creation process that is shared with our men. Our physical body goes through the creation process. Our men go through it spiritually and mentally and psychologically if they're in tune. Let me say that part, because some women get pregnant and they're like, pause. But those men that recognize ma'at, and especially if it's their child, their seed, they're going to be like a lion. Actually, more like a panther. Right, let me put that one out. Right, that nothing will come around. There's no sight until the mother has delivered, the child has grown and can operate independently. There's a different vibe. That's the essence. When I speak of that feminine principle, I'm talking about that ancestral, maternal vibration of protection that stayed inside of our African traditional ecosystems and, of course, our spiritual systems. That's part of it. So there was always a connection in that regard. It's only through warfare and misguided infiltration that changed, right? And then it became, even our creation myths, our creation stories. You would always hear about what the women did, and then you would hear about what the men did, and what happened with the children, and where the grandparents were. That's how it was a cycle that was regenerative, it was intergenerational, and it showed respect to the same 4 things I mentioned earlier. Agriculture. Let's remember who likes to go and plant food all the time.
100%. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Astronomy, architecture. Let's remember who likes to build on all levels. We build inside, yes, and women in Africa have no problem building their house alongside their men, and if not, with other sistren. And this is something that still exists now, right? And then we always talk about our language, our culture, our virtues, our morals, etc. There's a lot that comes with when we talk about African spirituality. And I hope for those that are listening, it may seem that I did not give you a history lesson, but I thought that this was more of a versation to really speak of verb, the verb portion of African traditional ecosystems and African traditional spirituality, because our ancestors are at the grounding of these things. That's why we always speak of venerating or venerated ancestors. Some people just say, I call on the ancestors. You can't call all of them. You need to be very methodical. And because sometimes you just call and you need to be mindful what you're asking for. Because all of them will come. And it might be that ancestor that might not need to be called right now. Right? Yeah. So there's an ancestral connection. There is a physiological connection. Of course, there's a psychological connection. So when we're speaking of body, mind, soul, spirit, and consciousness, we're also speaking of air, fire, earth, water, and spirit. We're also speaking of the wholeness that comes when you hear me speak of the Keri Sheta in terms of the lesser systems of knowledge. You also speak of the Heri Sheta, which is that higher part of the knowledge. When people speak of the principles that govern things, how we deal with logic, how we deal with rhetoric, how we deal with grammar, some people like to go into what those virtues and control systems are. Sometimes we speak of the virtues, and what does that really mean? Some people speak of the 10 Commandments, forgetting that the 10 Commandments are tied to 640 Mosaic laws amongst Judaism, and it's tied to the 42 laws of Ma'at that was written millennia before the Bible was formulated, right? So that's what come when we speak of African traditional ecosystems and African spirituality. We're speaking of the roots or the elder and eldris entities that are grounded and work within nature and recognize the sciences and the arts that govern the entire universe. And notice I'm not just saying this galaxy, the entire universe. So, I could have easily started talking about the Dogon and the Hogan. That's a whole other conversation. Ogutameli left so much information. People are still trying to uncover it now. We can speak of star systems that people saw with the naked eye, that we have microscopes and telescopes that can't, not microscopes, telescopes that still are trying to figure out what they are and where they that's why they thought Pluto was a planet until they found out it was a star. It took a while. But I'm just saying, these are things that our ancestors in their traditional ecosystems and in our African spiritual systems that were grounded in the original indigenous, homegrown first. And maybe first isn't the right word, but I'll just say, because there was a lot going on the planet. There was a lot of percolation of thought and process and teachings and narratives and engagement. So I hope that persons that have had an opportunity to hear some of this are able to at least gather that part, and I will remind people that the institutions that I've referenced, particularly at Federal University in Lokoja and the Academy of Africana Indigenous Religions, Theology, and Arts, is something that's available. We also have other entities. You have the Père Ankh Publishing that still exists, do the work in Senegal. You have a number of sisters and brothers that have continued to do ma'atical publications throughout the globe that are doing a variety of pieces. And again, like I always express to persons, it's good to know the history, but it's very important to move beyond the very limiting sciences that are man-made versus those that are ancestral, intelligence. So when we say AI, we say AI 360. We're speaking of not artificial, because it's not artificial what we're speaking of. We're speaking of ancestral intelligence that reigns and has reigned for millennia upon millennia upon millennia. And I'm looking forward to having another conversation. And then I'll just bring all of the historiography things and I can just quote stuff for persons that just want that kind of data. Yeah, because that's what I was hoping today to be a little bit lighter in terms of speaking truth as power, but through a lens of how we embrace our ancestral, ancient African, Nubian, New Kushan, New Kemetu heritage legacy. So when we're speaking of the Ankh legacy, we're speaking of it through a lens of what is practiced and how it can best be integrated so that we can sit in a space with our brothers and sisters that may not walk in that particular path and trod in their spiritual experience, but we can still show respect, honor, liberty, and sovereign engagement together. I hope that that helps a little with what we were talking about today.
Oh, yes, it was very, very informative. I'm sure the audience are very pleased and they would like you to come back again, return, because you have a lot to share and to continue and to continue the conversation. I wanted to ask you the last question before we regarding the dress code and and uh, and the dress code of the predominant of the Catholic Church and other churches that came from it, with the hat and the waistcoat and the crown and the crown they wear, even the scepter that they wear. And when you look at those borrowed or stolen ideas, even the gown they wear, which symbolic of the feminine principle, because when they make the sister the miss or the ghost in their teachings. Um, so when you look at those ideas, what can you share with the public about this commonality with the dress code and what the priests wear, the scepter and the crown the Pope would wear? And it's almost like copy for copy. What can you share with the audience about that?
We've been pretty friendly and balanced so far, so we're going to keep it in that space of vibe. I said it a little earlier that the systems seem very familiar to our people and to most of humanity because it comes out of our system. The waset, that staff that we watch them carry, we can, and this is where what we're doing today, it's important. We can talk, but it's important to start to, in the future, make sure that we both have access to share with our viewers. Those that are listening, great, but I encourage you, send me an email to askspeaks@gmail.com and I can share with you a series of articles that show the similarities of the crowns, especially between Northern and Southern Kemet. And then it can show in different iterations the crowns that our women, what a pera, not a pharaoh, but a pera or perat, the crowns of Hatshepsut, the crowns of Namer. You need to see them to see the similarity, because we can speak that here, but then persons are going to be like, they're not going to get it. That they need to see what that similarity is like, because a lot of it is duplication to annihilate the truth. Many times persons, it's very interesting, whenever I go to do a ceremony, I'm in traditional, usually traditional whites, unless it's a particular, like today I have the shroud from the Pokomo of Kenya as a Queen Mother, an initiate with His Royal Majesty King Dr. Makarani Mungase the seventh of the Pocomo, yeah? So today I chose to keep that just as a reminder and reference to these types of conversations on African traditional spirituality, because while we have these types of conversations around Catholicism or even Islam, the attire becomes, how people attire themselves, the the protective garments that we wear are very similar. And that's why when I walk into a Catholic church, which I did quite recently for several funerals, celebrations of life, let me rephrase that, the priest knew who I was before they saw my ankh on my arm, because they could see that vibration of that collar. For us as a female, I will have a manat around my collar, and it's a protective piece. In addition, it's pretty to look at, but it's a protective piece to guard the area that protects our heart as well as our throat, right? In terms of how we speak, how we utter.
Utterance, yeah.
Right. And it's important to know that I don't call it copycatting, because some of these priests, they don't know. They didn't know. They just were raised following the catechism that was given to them from young. And once they're raised with that, and they have a book that tells you, do not question what is in this book. The minute you do that, then it becomes an attack on your faith.
Yep.
So free will becomes an issue as well. So I really, because we have some limitations on time, I would just simplistically say that there is, when you know something is righteous and you know something is harmonious and it restores justice and truth, you tend to copy it. It shouldn't be copied to the layer that you bastardize the root, or that you commit ancestral treason to the root. It shouldn't be that. However, that is what has happened in many regards. And it's not just the Catholic tradition. There's several traditions of religion. And I want to make sure I highlight, it's the religiosity part, that man-made, organized, obligatory religiosity part, that divides instead of binding, or more correctly, yoking together. That's what the issue is. That's why you have some Christians and Jews that don't have to fight, and Muslims, they don't fight. They can go to the same wall. One's going to pray in Hebrew, even though it's a restored Hebrew. Some going to pray in Ge'ez. Some going to pray in Latin. Some going to pray in other, in Arabic, right? Yeah. And they can go to that same wall and pray.
The wedding wall, yeah.
The way that they know in their systems. And in African traditional spirituality, that's why in its essence, we were able to do that. And we did. So that's why when we can speak in different tongues, some are going to speak in Basa, some are going to speak in Hausa, some are going to speak in Yoruba, some are going to speak in Igbo, however it flows, right? If you're using the Meta Nature, or if you're even using another tongue, because there's hundreds and hundreds of languages in the 12 million square miles of the African continent. And that's just the continent, much less where we have dispersed. So I think that I'm very cautious when I speak of these things, because again, I really encourage persons, listen to the message and go into your own realm of study, right? And then you will know some of the Catholic priests were Africans out of the continent, and still are, because they know some of the root of where Catholicism, while it twisted into something else, and where the Vatican,
Roman Catholicism,
right, it became and it became a papacy that created papal bulls that we're not going to talk about today, but we could talk about them today, because several of them, most of them, were never revoked, including those that allowed for genocidal terrorism that exists into 2026, right? So That's how come I'm very mindful of the what we attire ourselves with, how we carry ourselves when we wear a shroud, right? That we recognize that our ancestors set the standard of excellence when it comes to spiritual ecosystems, spiritual institutions, and spiritual traditions that are still being duplicated, plagiarized in many contemporary religious systems. I've learned to become more diplomatic as I've gotten older.
It's a wise thing.
I know where I
Um,
reside.
yeah, cool, yeah. Um, Looking forward in us continuing or building on what we started today. I like the way you serve um, the starter of the conversation, very light, and looking forward in building um, for the audience to see the progression and how far we can get in empowering our people again with the right terminologies, the right words, the right expressions, the right vibrations, because we are people that has been shaken, and a lot of us are traumatized.
Mhm.
So this is why it's so important for sisters or queens like you to find your purpose and come and share it from the highest mountain and to the widest valley for our people to be awakened at this very, 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 very important time of our existence.
Grateful. Your words just remind me to highlight that culture heals humanity, land is our foundation, and spiritual harmony unifies us. So when we speak of being a parent, like you have your individual house of life here, but then you have your house of life with your family and your family circle, your community. You have your house of life in your wider societal community or nation to some, yeah. And then we have a wider peranku for our entire civilization that respects culture, healing, arts, technology, spirituality, so that we can authentically support and honor life, inspiration, freedom, and education all the time. And more so, edification, because through that, our sovereign spiritual systems will continually be respected. And that's what we're working towards. Like definitely, I have like a kata. If you can't respect the system I follow, I'm good. I minimize conflict by minimizing contact. I go right back to Neely Fuller and that one in terms of understanding this type of Eurasian mixed terrorism, genocidal, systematic destruction of us. And we keep pulling more and more away from that. So if we can be in the company of one another that supports these things, if we can do more engagement. We've just come out of a very powerful full moon, a very powerful winter solstice. We speak of the festival of Knum. When people speak of the epiphany, even today is around select elements. We talk about Catholicism. This is Three Kings Day. And we need to remember who those three kings, even in their mythological representation, who they were
Hmm.
and which son of light they were
Wow.
honoring.
Yeah, yeah.
I'm just saying, in a very loving, caring way, how to, ways that we can begin to share love and engaging mercies amongst one another. How do we show that authentic, livicated principle of divine righteousness amongst one another? And I remember getting a message from one of our sisters. Again, keeper, she is an awo, knowledgeable initiatrix in the Akan tradition as spiritual systems, as well as Ifa, Yoruba, and very knowledgeable. And I give a special shout out to my spirit sister, Donna Fofie of the Sankofa community, and they are based in Jamaica and do a lot of work. But I want to share a message that came from the Sankofa community, if I may.
Yes, can have the.
Okay. Praying for you a spiritually prosperous 2026. Our body is here on earth to house the soul, resolve karma, evolve into higher consciousness. Our mind is here on earth to cultivate wisdom, discern for the soul, align with divine will. Our mind is here on earth to reveal true purpose. Our spirit is here on earth to master duality, maintain cosmic order, embody divine qualities. Our spirit is here on earth to fulfill ancestral duties, resolve karma, enjoy physical experiences. We are here on earth with divine purpose, with creator natural rhythms, our soul self and cosmic order. We are divine sparks manifesting in physical form to acquire wisdom, fulfill karmic duties, and maintain cosmic balance. It's 2026. You have a clean slate. Predict your own life. I just shared that with you from the Sankofa community, which is a community that again embraces me as an Ankh priestess, and I embrace the Akan, the Ifa, and all of the African traditional ancestral ecosystems and spiritual systems and institutions that offer that same ma'atical reciprocity part and respect and honor and security and sovereign ancestral intelligence and beyond. I'm giving thanks. It's been an honor.
Ashe.
Ashe, you on, sir.
Thanks very much. So we'll speak again pretty soon. Have a beautiful day and thanks again.
Give thanks. Hotep.
Hotep, yes.